Researchers at MassINC are adding one more disparity in their look at mass incarceration. Along with people of color being disproportionately represented in prison, there's also a disparity in bail, and that often means a disparity in who's locked up while awaiting trial. To tell us about the study is our guest from MassINC, the Director of Research, Ben Forman. Thank you very much for being with us, Ben.
Thank you, Chris, for having me.
First of all, talk about these numbers, what you've found in bail.
Well, a couple of things. One that was most pronounced was the racial and ethnic disparities in the percentage of people that are being held awaiting trial. We hold people before trial because we don't think they'll come back, or because we think that they're too dangerous to let out to the community. But in the data that we look at around the state, in some counties, in Barnstable County, for example, 2.5% of the population is African American, 25% of the people who are awaiting trial in jail are African American. So you see these very large disparities.
What do you think might account for this? Because are these people being assessed very, very high amounts for bail, and it's just hard to raise that much money?
Well, we see that as well. So people who are released on bail are asked to pay for 5 times more if they're Latino or African American in many parts of the state. So there are two sort of different things that go into this. People who are released on bail, that's because they're not deemed a risk. The bail is just to make sure they come back for trial. So when you're looking at a white person who's released on bail, and you set an amount to ensure they come back for trial, or a black person who's released on jail and you set an amount to ensure they come back for trial, it's not really clear why one should be so much higher than the other. So that's a real concern. We weren't able to get those data from Suffolk County and many other parts of the state. Only 3 counties had those data. And I think the overwhelming issue we draw attention to is just the lack of data. We need more data to answer these questions so we can make sure that we're using our jail resource wisely, keeping those people who need to be kept and letting go those who don't need to be kept, and fairly.
Because one of the things you could possibly sift out here is whether the amounts of bail in some way reflect the seriousness of the offense.
Well, the way bail is supposed to be set by statute in Massachusetts, the offense shouldn't have anything to do with it. Really, it should just be about the person's risk to reappear for trial.
Or unless the judge has some really solid grounds for saying this person's too dangerous to let out into the street.
And if that's the case, then we would see that they're being held on dangerousness. They'd have a separate hearing to determine that they're dangerous and they wouldn't be released. But there's no real correlation between what offense you committed and your likelihood of coming back for trial. And so that's not really a good way to determine who should come back and who should not. That may be going on, but legally we're not supposed to do it that way, and the research suggests that that's not the most appropriate way to make determinations about who stays and who goes.
What would be a more appropriate way?
Well, there are these things called validated risk assessment tools that many states use, and they take all the information that we have about a person, they put it into a formula, and they tell us the probability that a person is going to come back for trial or commit another crime while they're waiting for trial. And that kind of information can be really helpful to a judge. These are busy people who are seeing lots of people in a chaotic sort of courtroom environment. Having that kind of empirical data can help them make decisions and make sure or do the best we can to remove bias from those decisions.
Well, if keeping people locked up before trial isn't necessary in terms of at least public safety, how does it hurt the pursuit of justice?
Well, there's a lot of research that shows if you're kept awaiting trial in prison, you're more likely to plead guilty, you're more likely to be sentenced to incarceration and actually to a longer stay in prison. So from that perspective, it's not necessarily efficient or fair. But it also is harmful because it makes people more likely to commit more crimes. We know from the research that once you get in, you're along for the ride. And so if we take away your car, we take away your housing, we disconnect your ties to your family, because we're holding you there awaiting trial, we've just increased your criminality. And so to the extent that we can keep people out of the system until it's determined that they need to be incarcerated, they committed an offense, or that some other sanction for whatever offense they committed in the community isn't appropriate. You know what I mean? We really want to use our corrections resources wisely because we only have so many dollars to spend keeping people safe. the data can help us spend those dollars better and get better outcomes for us.
Well, of course, the big picture that you're working on is how many people we're keeping locked up needlessly, or at least longer than they need to be. Prosecutors they keep pushing back. They say, well, you know, some of these people, even if it's drug offenses, you know, if you scratch under the surface, there's some violence involved there. They're saying that these people do need to be locked up.
And Chris, it all goes back to the data. All around the country, states are trying to fix their correction systems, and they're doing it based on data. States that have done it based on data have found that this front door, this pretrial piece, is important, and then they can let a lot of people out and save a lot of money. And I think the same is true when we're talking about whether we have drug offenders who belong there or not. The data are telling us that a very significant percentage of people who are serving mandatory minimums for drug offenses have no or very limited criminal histories. Prosecutors are saying that's not true. Well, if there's an issue with the data, let's fix that so that we can be all making decisions based on sound information. But we've got some work to do to get our data systems in order.
You mentioned this cycle of going back over and over again, reoffending over and over again too, but you mentioned about the ability to drive a car, and right now at the State House they're trying to do something about that.
Yes, the Senate voted last week or the week before to take away some of those penalties for people who have drug offenses. They'd lose their license, even if cars had nothing to do with the commission of the crime. It was just in the statute. If you committed this drug offense, you lost your license. So the Senate is trying to undo some of that. We're waiting on the House to act as well. But you know, this is just another example of the steps that we're taking to move towards a more evidence-based approach to crime and corrections, and away from the tough on crime approach that really we're learning was not always the most effective way.
Of course, the other message that you're working on here is that we've had this enormous increase in the number of people being incarcerated nationwide. And in recent years, we've seen this decrease in crime. There are people saying, well, crime went down because more people were being locked up, but you also have been questioning that.
Yeah, I mean, the National Academy of Sciences convened an expert panel of, I don't know, dozens and dozens of economists and criminologists to look at that question, and they found that sure, the increase in incarceration explained a small percentage of the drop in crime, but the overwhelming majority of it couldn't be explained by our increased use of incarceration.
Okay. Thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you again. My pleasure.
From MassINC, Ben Forman. And we'll have more news in just a moment.